Thank you so much for allowing me the pleasure to be here before you. You're going to find out real quick I'm not too much of a public speaker, but I do like to tell stories. And I like to tell you one today about Dave Allison. Some of you may have him confused with an old-time outlaw named Clay Allison, but as far as we can tell, there's no relationship. For some reason, with all the hype that goes on and with movie makers and script writers and stuff, somewhere over the line back in the old days, the people like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday got a lot of attention. Most of their reputations, whether y'all want to believe it or not, was made in the 20th century, not particularly at the time they lived. Dave Allison, on the other hand, had a heck of a reputation during the time he lived, but after the century clock turned and got on, and after we get to his demise, his story more or less faded into the mist of some kind of nothingness. Some of you may be familiar with him. Dave was born June the 21st in 1861, and of all places for a real Westerner, Cincinnati, Ohio. But have no fear, his daddy was a Confederate from Mississippi, and his daddy, John Pryor Allison, was just in Cincinnati going to medical school. When the war broke out, his daddy joined up with the Confederacy, and they moved back to Mississippi. In his early life, I've got to be real careful. I've got to tell a man's 60-year life story in 10 minutes. That's a challenge. Dave, as a young man, the family moved first to Houston, where he lost a sister. Then they moved to McKinney, and then they moved to Brownwood. His daddy's practicing medicine, so Dave's not exactly the typical hard-scrabble type cowboy, but he gets fascinated with the cow business or the cowboy business, and it just so happens that some of the other people that end up in Midland, like the Connells, they're at Brownwood too. They make a migration out to this country and start settling in Midland after the railroad. Dave Allison comes out here as a young man and starts cowboying, working on ranches, but because of his education and because I guess his daddy wanted him to be a little bit more, they quickly recognized that they might have somebody that could make a step up above being a cowboy. And since he was inclined to be, in other words, why not get one of our own in there? So they got Dave elected sheriff. In 1888, he was sheriff of Midland. At the time, he was the youngest sheriff in the state of Texas. He was 27 years old. He stays in Midland as sheriff through 5 more elected cycles. Now, in those days, they were 2-year cycles rather than 4. He does all kinds of nice things. He develops a reputation as being absolutely fearless. Now, sometimes there may be things that are questionable that old Dave Allison does, but nobody ever questioned that he had the real sand in his system. You didn't mess with old Dave. How this has got lost sometime in history, we don't know. There was a little allegation that the county funds come up a little bit short, but that was a common deal during election cycles, and Dave Allison resigns and joins the Texas Rangers. He's out at Isleta. He stays out there from October till December, then he resigns the Texas Rangers, and he comes back here, but the reason he resigned is to get a commission as a special ranger. The Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, it may have been called the Northwest Cattle Raisers Association at that time. I can't remember, Jane, when they made the transition. But Dave Allison was a special investigator with the Cattle Association. He stayed with that a while, and then he went back and joined the Rangers again and became a Texas Ranger Sergeant and was stationed at Marathon down at the top of the Big Bend country. We can go back and look at all kinds of Ranger records and the monthly returns and find all kinds of things he did, people he arrested and patrols and scouts, and I surely can't go into them today. After that, he resigned the Rangers when they transferred that company down into the valley at Brownsville, down way past the King Ranch country. And he wrote a letter and says, I can't go. He said, that tropical climate's going to hurt my wife who's sick. I've got too many, and this is really atypical for a Texas Ranger of those days. He says, I've got too much household goods to move. I can't afford to move all my stuff. And he said, besides, it's mainly Mexican and I don't speak the language. Well, they transferred the company anyway, and so Dave Allison resigns. By this time, his father-in-law, Robert Johnston, one of the ones that was in the founding of the First National Bank here at Midland, had gone on over to Roswell. Dave, goes up to Roswell for a while, and then in 1903, because of the prestige of the Texas Rangers in Texas, Arizona started them some Arizona Rangers, and Dave got involved with the Arizona Rangers. He was involved with them, got promoted to a sergeant, later as a lieutenant. They had a big riot at the Mauricia copper mines in 1903 and did all kinds of gunfire and all this kind of stuff. It's just an old West tale within itself. But I'm only, just barely scratching the surface on Dave's story. And I know I'm 5, good. And so after that, Dave resigns from the Rangers. Some say because he gambled a little too much. That's what one Ranger captain said. I don't know if that's true or not. If it is, and if that did hurt his job, that was the only thing in his career at that point, because he didn't ever have any women problems, gambling problems, or drinking problems later in his life. So if he did lose his job with Arizona Rangers as a lieutenant, it might have been a wake-up call to him if he was spending too much time at the card table. But he came back, and it just so happens that the chief of police at Roswell was murdered by a bootlegger. They had a big, wet, dry election, and they called it the Whiskey War, and I mean, they were stamping out sin in Roswell, Roswell, New Mexico. And James O. Lynch, a bad bootlegger, killed the chief of police, a man named Roy Woofter. I've written about him at length, too. And so they needed somebody that was really tough, and they turned to Dave Allison. Of course, the fact that his father-in-law was at 700 North Lee, involved in the banking and ranching business over there, and a high-powered guy from Midland, Texas, and that the mayor's father-in-law was the famous rancher C.C. Slaughter, that helped a little bit. By and large, Dave came over there, and if you can go back to the old newspaper files, you can see where he basically gets credited for cleaning up Roswell and taking Roswell more or less into the 20th century. But in 1915, he goes to Sierra Blanca to work not as a Cattle Raisers Association inspector, but the private ranchers are all chipping in money to have him. He carries a constable's commission to give him legal authority, but he's more or less a private range detective. George Patton, we're right there at the Mexican Revolution. This is in 1915. It started in 10. George Patton comes there as a little second lieutenant. Probably 22 years old or something like that. And he writes his wife, Beatrice, a letter, and he says, "Dear Beatrice, I just got to Sierra Blanca. You wouldn't believe it. The men still wear boots and spurs, and all of them have guns. There's not another place like this in the world. I wouldn't miss this for a thing. I just met Mr. Dave Allison today. He is the most noted gunman in Texas. He's an old man now with white hair and a sweet face." Well, just a few months later, there's this famous Mexican, some people call him a Mexican revolutionary patriot. Some call him, probably this crowd in here, if we're raising cows and he's coming across the border, would say Pascual Orozco Jr. is a bandit. He gets put in jail. He escapes from El Paso with 5 of his guys. They get caught running through the Eagle Mountains. They wire over to Van Horn. Dave Allison and the customs agent are out horseback. Anyway, they run all this bunch of bandidos. I'll use it for Pascual Orozco. And they get them up in the canyon. The bad guys were thinking they were cool enough to sit down and quit and smoke and take a nap, a little siesta, and guess who comes riding over the rim? And they smoke all these Mexicans. There was a big outcry on the border. It was terrible. So what do? Well, we have a trial. We try 11 of the people in Van Horn, Dave Allison, the customs, the sheriffs. Now this trial, they get indicted by the grand jury, and then in just a few minutes later, they show up on the courthouse and say, "We're ready for trial." They get arrested. They go in, they have a trial that lasts an hour. They're found not guilty of murder. And so, under your Fifth Amendment protection for double jeopardy, you can't be tried again, and the matter's closed. The Hispanics in El Paso and across the border are mad as hornets. The ranchers that have been losing cattle to these incursions are saying, yay, we won. It all sounds great. Dave Allison then goes, 3 minutes? 2, okay. Dave Allison then goes to work for the Cattle Raisers Association. He gets stationed at Post, Texas. Now this time he's really a Southwestern Cattle Raisers inspector. He and a man named Horace Roberson, who I could talk hours about myself on him, they caught Milton Paul Good, which some of you are familiar with him. They caught him with 516 head of stolen cattle out here north of town. I don't know, I'm not swearing. If y'all can tell me better, well fine. But as far as I know, that's the largest single seizure of stolen cattle, and that record hadn't been topped as of yet in one incident. Now that may, different?
No, I don't.
Okay, well, I mean, it may be different. They caught Milt Good. In another investigation, a man named Hillary U. Loftus, who was now, he's been an outlaw, and he's came back to this territory after being in a couple of shootouts with the Texas Rangers, and he's adopted the name Tom Ross. He gets indicted by the grand jury on cattle theft cases. Dave Allison calls Horace Roberson. They get Burke Spiller with the Cattle Raisers Association, says, you guys be in court Seminole, Texas for grand jury without fail. You've got these cases on Tom Ross and on Milt Good. Milt Good was a world champion steer roper in 1920. They're sitting in the hotel. It's April Fool's Day. Easter Sunday, by coincidence, 1923. There's a bunch of them just like us sitting here, and boom, boom, boom. Tom Ross and Milt Good come in there and kill them. Dave Allison's life story is over. Horace Roberson's story is over. Milt Good goes on to be in and out of penitentiary 2 or 3 times. Tom Ross runs off to Montana, allegedly kills a Chinese cook at a ranch, comes back in Browning, Montana, close to that country, shoots his foreman because his foreman on the ranch doesn't know a damn thing about cattle, and then goes into the bunkhouse, puts his .45 to his head, and says, goodbye, cruel world. And I wished I could talk about this all afternoon, but it's been my pleasure. Thank you.